In the grim darkness of the 41st millennia, there is only war. For 10,000 years, the immortal God Emperor has sat on his golden throne while his Imperium and mankind itself are on the brink of destruction, surrounded by aliens, heretics, and the dark gods themselves. To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. There is no peace amongst the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter, and the laughter of thirsting gods. Sounds pretty cool, huh? Well, that's because it is. Welcome to the world of Warhammer 40K, a setting you can easily get lost in regardless of how you consume it. Like video games? Well, 40K has you covered. It has, by far, the best boomer shooter that I've ever played. 2 great Left 4 Dead-like experiences, one where you're a mighty veteran, wandering through an alien-filled ship looking for relics, and another where you're fighting to save a hive city from demonic forces. It also offers real-time strategy games that range from base-building resource gathering you're probably used to from StarCraft, or more of a combination of that with role-playing elements. Its recent release, Space Marine 2, is actually one of the fastest-selling games of the year, being right behind Helldivers 2. And if video games aren't really your thing, there's an entire library worth of novels, comics, and even some shows to watch. And Warhammer 40K's origin story goes way back. Even though it's a science fiction series taking place 38,000 years in the future, and created in the United Kingdom, its story starts in America, with a wargame taking place in a medieval setting. That game was Chainmail, developed by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin. It was a miniature wargame where players commanded different miniature units on a battlefield. It wasn't the first, considering chess's predecessor, Chaturanga, has been traced back to 625 AD. But even if you consider that reaching a little, the first publicized miniature wargame was released in 1913, called Little Wars. It was written by H.G. Wells, you know, the author of The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, and The War of the Worlds, to name a few. But unlike modern wargames, this one, you would use a toy cannon to knock over your opponent's lead figures. Its full title was Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. You could have been 12 years old in 1913 when it came out, and still be in the game's target audience today. Not many games can say that. And while Little Wars had the tried and true lead toy cannon, Chainmail had one feature that Little Wars didn't, and that was dice. Adding in dice to the mix brought chance into the game. This didn't mean that strategy no longer mattered. In fact, it was more important than ever, because at any point, through no fault of your own, you could roll poorly. On the other hand of the spectrum, anyone playing tabletop games with dice like Warhammer and D&D can very well tell you about how at one point or another, when something should have failed, they made the only possible dice throw needed to come out on top. Like I said earlier, Chainmail was set in a medieval setting and was being played all the time at the local gaming club. But one day, Gary Gygax thought that it would be funny to put a model troll underneath one of the bridges on the table they were using to play, and the people there thought it was pretty funny too. Gygax then wrote an entire fantasy supplement to the game, adding in wizards, dragons, elves, hobbits, and even magical swords, something that co-creator Jeff Perrin did not know about until it was done.
He edited the rules as I wrote them. I wrote the first half. I covered the historical aspects, the combat charts, etc. He did touch-ups here and there. He added the jousting matrix and this and that, but added the whole section on dragons and wizards and stuff like that, which I looked upon with abhorrence, saying, "What is that?" It was like totally unheard of in the hobby at the time. And we tried a game or two with it, and it was fun, but it was outside of the realm of history that I was comfortable with.
Chainmail was then published in 1971, and while this wouldn't become a household name, it still sold pretty well for what it was. But it was its successor game that would really take off and be one of those things that was harder not to hear about than the other way around.
Your dungeon master has placed you in a dreadfully precarious position. You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created. Your skin grows cold from your first glimpse of the enormous beast. It's a product of your imagination. Survival depends on a quick, decisive move. Your choices are limited. Stand and fight, or run. Use your lightning bolt. Victory is yours.
Win the treasure.
TSR Hobbies. Dungeons & Dragons game. Products of your imagination.
Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D for short, wasn't like Chainmail where two or more players faced off each other using different armies, where there would be winners and losers. But instead, it was a game that really perplexed some people at the time. That's because everyone was on the same side, and simultaneously role-playing a character that they created in a fantasy world, where the goals were to level up, collect gold and treasure, and just overall have fun. Something that really got people at the time was even though there was another player that was in control of all the enemies known as the Dungeon Master, he wasn't the player's opponent and acted more like a director and a referee in one. The game's rules were pretty loosely defined, spanning a total of 7 books once all was said and done, as well as also suggesting that those playing owned a copy of Chainmail for combat, at least until the final supplement, Swords and Spells, was released in 1976, being dubbed the grandson to Chainmail in its opening text. However, it was not very well received, and its rules that were introduced were later removed in other editions. Even with its flaws in its early stages, Dungeons & Dragons ended up selling well enough to go forward with both a basic and advanced version of the game, until they ended up combining it into one rule set starting in 2000 with its 3rd edition. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves, because around Dungeons & Dragons' humble beginnings, there was another gaming company on the rise in England, that being a startup called Games Workshop. Going back to January 1975, and 3 roommates, Steve Jackson, Ian Livingstone, and John Peake, who all loved playing board games, founded their own company that they named Games Workshop. They started making their own wooden board games, and to help promote their product, also started a newsletter called Owl and Weasel. The idea was that in order to be a real hardcore gamer, you needed to be as wise as an owl, and as cunning as a weasel. No mention of screaming like a rage pig, but it was the 1970s, so we can cut them a break. Well, one day in 1975, gaming would be changed forever. While at a board game convention, the 3 roommates saw Dungeons & Dragons for the first time, and even though the only way to get a copy of it was to import one from the USA, paying in US dollars, they managed to get themselves a copy that had been sent to them from Gary Gygax himself. They loved the game so much that they imported as many copies as all 3 of them could afford, so that way they could sell them. That being said, all they could afford was 6 copies of the game. But this was a time of opportunity, and that was enough copies purchased at once to make them the exclusive distributor of Dungeons & Dragons for 3 years in the entirety of Europe. There's nothing really else to say about that, it's one of the best deals of all time. The 3 roommates then started their own gaming convention called Games Day, and by the 3rd one, they had over 1,500 people attending, as well as 200 people playing in their Dungeons & Dragons competitions, seeing which group could get through a gaming module the fastest. Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, seeing all the success they had, decided to go all in on selling role-playing games. This caused the 3rd co-founder, John Peake, to leave the company. This was not a light decision, and none of the trio liked it, but as an emerging company, they had to move on. Even though Games Workshop had just lost a third of their company, Ian and Steve decided to press forward, getting an actual office for the company while living out of a van together. A van that they called Van Morrison. Steve and Ian then both got memberships at their local squash club, so that way they could still shower. But because the boys were absolutely broke and had no money, were sometimes stuck eating lime and pickle sandwiches for dinner. But then, Steve and Ian had an idea. No company in the beginning would publish Dungeons & Dragons, so Gary Gygax and Don Kay collected $2,400 to start a publisher company called Tactical Studies Rules, which would eventually be shortened to TSR. And once TSR finally got going, they started a magazine called The Dragon in 1976. In this magazine, it would have new rules for Dungeons & Dragons, such as new monsters, spells, actions, popular campaign settings like the Forgotten Realms, and more. The Games Workshop duo then took a risk and launched their own tabletop gaming magazine called White Dwarf. The idea was that the name could work for both a fantasy and sci-fi setting, but the biggest problem with this business endeavor was that Games Workshop had to print 4,000 copies of their first issue in order to go through with it. After thinking about it heavily, the duo went through with it, And while initially White Dwarf was sold through game stores and subscriptions, it became so popular they had to print another 2,000 copies of the first issue to keep up. White Dwarf was such a success that the team was not only able to get a new office, but also had to start hiring more staff. But that wasn't the only idea for expansion that they had. One of the many things that made Dungeons & Dragons so different from Chainmail was that you did not need any miniatures whatsoever in order to play. If you had the rules, paper, pencil, and dice, you were good to go. But lots of players like to have their own little guy on the table, and recognizing that, in 1978, Steve and Ian became board directors on the newly founded Citadel Miniatures. By this point, Citadel had the rights to make miniatures for Doctor Who, Judge Dredd, Paranoia, Dungeons & Dragons, Star Trek, and even Lord of the Rings. Because their models were set in a heroic scale as opposed to a realistic one, they also became the king of fantasy figures. White Dwarf and Citadel were both great successes, but Brian Ansel, the co-founder of Citadel Miniatures, had an idea that launched Games Workshop into the stratosphere. What if they could get people to buy a regiment of figures for a large-scale game as opposed to individual heroes that they would use in an RPG? What if, instead of somebody bringing one of their painted miniatures onto the table while the rest were shelved, he was able to bring in all of them? That led to the creation of Warhammer Fantasy, the mass combat fantasy role-playing game, in 1983. Its rulebook had about 3,000 copies made, and just like with that first issue of White Dwarf, it sold out real fast, creating another run. At the time, the game didn't have much lore to it, and it also combined role-playing along with wargaming. But Warhammer, as it was known at the time, would then go the way of D&D, having new rules added through its magazine White Dwarf. And only 2 years later had its second edition come out. And from that point on until 2015, arguably until 2016, Warhammer Fantasy was the most popular fantasy wargame in the world, with a deep lore added to it throughout its new rulebooks and even novels. Warhammer Fantasy was pretty popular in the tabletop space, but nothing compared to its science fantasy variant, Warhammer 40K. In 1986, TSR, the D&D publisher, betrayed Games Workshop, revoking the license to make official Dungeons & Dragons miniatures, instead giving it to the American company Ralpartha Enterprises, leaving Games Workshop to have to sell off the remaining stock at a discounted price. At least, the models that weren't melted down and recasted into something else. But at the end of the day, that didn't matter because Games Workshop had already won. That's because that same year, Games Workshop created their ultimate moneymaker, C-100 Imperial Troops, a science fiction batch of models known as Space Marines that would be usable the next year in their new game, Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. It may have been set 38,000 years in the future, but don't let that fool you because this game is not science fiction, it's science fantasy. This game has orcs, elves, magic, demons, and dark gods, while also simultaneously having aliens. People liked Warhammer Fantasy, but it eventually got to the point where more boxes of the Space Marine Tactical Squad, a very good box set by the way, would outsell the entire Warhammer Fantasy line. Things were going beyond great for Games Workshop, but not so much TSR. That's because by 1996, TSR had very little money left and a whole lot of debt. $30 million in debt. Adjusting for inflation, that would be $58.43 million in 2024 money. Thankfully for them, another company would show up called Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast was a publisher based out of Seattle, Washington that's mainly known for its game Magic the Gathering. When Magic's creator, Richard Garfield, went to Wizards of the Coast looking to see if they would publish his board game Robo Rally, he was told that it was too risky to produce. However, if he made a game that was portable and could be played during the downtime that happened at gaming cons, they would happily look into it. Richard then had the idea of a card game where players could pick one of 5 colors to identify with, white, black, red, blue, and green, that had a possibility of infinite expansions. After pitching it, Wizards immediately saw its potential and said yes. That being said, Wizards then also made some very bad financial decisions and would eventually be bought out in 1999 by Hasbro, leaving Games Workshop as the last one of its kind. That's because one of the poor financial decisions that Wizards of the Coast made was purchasing TSR. This was a shame because at that time the fantasy genre was about to see a boom in popularity like never before. In 1995, a director named Peter Jackson wanted to do a fantasy movie, but after trying to come up with original ideas, he was stuck. Everything he tried to do was too related to Tolkien. So, curious about the rights situation, he went to a Hollywood producer and now convicted sex offender named Harvey Weinstein for help. Harvey Weinstein was able to use his connections to get them the rights to make the movies on the Lord of the Rings, but unfortunately not The Hobbit like they wanted to. What was originally going to be 2 movies telling the story of the Lord of the Rings was then apparently going to be dropped down to just 1 due to monetary concerns. Peter Jackson asked if the movie could have a 4-hour runtime so that way they could keep as much of the story intact as possible, and was told that if he wanted to do this, it had to be 2 hours long. After refusing to cut any of the story, Harvey Weinstein then threatened to replace Peter Jackson with Quentin Tarantino or John Madden as director, something that Peter Jackson didn't believe would actually happen. Peter Jackson would then end up pitching the 2 movies to the CEO of New Line Cinema at the time, Robert Shea, who accepted the offer so long as it was a trilogy instead, just like the 3 novels that they were based on. Fun fact, by the way, Lord of the Rings was originally one single book that was split up into 3 smaller titles. Oh, and you see this orc? This guy was actually based off Harvey Weinstein's appearance. From that point on, production started into the Lord of the Rings trilogy. All 3 films were filmed back to back, becoming some of the most beloved movies of all time. These movies were as loved back then as they are today, and Games Workshop was ready to cash in on the hype. Like I said earlier, Games Workshop had the rights to produce Lord of the Rings miniatures in the 1980s, and they got the rights to do it again in 2001, creating a Lord of the Rings version of Warhammer. All the models based off the main characters got the actor's seal of approval too. It may be the least popular version of Warhammer today, but it got a lot of people through the door, ready to move on to the other Games Workshop products. This is where we finally get our story's main character. Matt Ward would finally make his appearance. When Matt Ward was young, he was introduced to Lord of the Rings at around 7 years old, and in his youth was also gifted a copy of HeroQuest for Christmas. HeroQuest was a dungeon crawler board game set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, similar to its 40K counterpart Space Crusade, which Matthew Ward also owned. At the time, White Dwarf would release new rules for HeroQuest in its monthly issues, and after getting hooked, Matt Ward eventually started playing Warhammer Fantasy in its 3rd edition.
And then I ended up with a copy of HeroQuest one Christmas. And then it steadily starts to snowball from there because, of course, you have all the White Dwarf tie-ins. You go, oh, look, now you can go and put Skaven into your HeroQuest, and we've done the Advanced HeroQuest one as well. And steadily lure you in. You know, the first hit is free. It's that, isn't it?
While this could have been the perfect origin story for someone working at Games Workshop, especially the most infamous employee that they have ever had, but Matt Ward would say in an interview with Entmoot Videos that it was never that to him, and it just so happened to be that they were hiring while he was looking for a job.
But not everyone gets to go and work at Games Workshop. Was it always an ambition, and how did it happen?
I don't know that you say it was always an ambition. I don't know that I particularly had ambitions of what I was going to do as I was growing up. But it's the world's most boring story of how I actually worked there is because they were hiring and I applied. And it really is, this, you know, everyone wants to, oh no, look, it was the lifelong dream, or it's this wonderful crux of circumstance and fate. And you say, no, they were hiring and I applied and they hired me. It turned out there were 2 jobs going in the end because they wanted someone for Lord of the Rings, and that's the one that I ended up doing, which, as I hadn't looked at or touched the game system, and then to go into an interview and go, oh yeah, go away and write some scenarios for this.
Not long after he started working there, and Matt Ward would make his first official appearance in White Dwarf, where he was one of the players in a Lord of the Rings battle report. Essentially, a play-by-play of a Warhammer IRL match that was played in the studio. Matt Ward would then get to write for the Lord of the Rings Warhammer 2 Towers and Return of the King supplements, before working on the first true original expansion, Shadows and Flame. An expansion that let players play as the dwarves and goblins in the mines of Moria before the Fellowship of the Ring got there. The books that Mr. Ward had written for sold pretty well, considering that this was at the all-time height of the Lord of the Rings popularity. And because he was able to prove that he was able to write for them, Games Workshop gave Matt Ward total control of an army book in 2008. By this point, for 40K and Fantasy, you would have the main rulebook as well as a specialized one, dedicated to the weapons, units, and special rules for your army. In 40K they're called Codexes, and in Fantasy they were called army books. Matt Ward was tasked with the Demons of Chaos army book, and instead he broke the entire 7th edition of Warhammer Fantasy. The Chaos Demons were immune to the rules Fear, Terror, and Panic that were normally used to balance out the other armies, were able to absolutely exploit the magic system to the demon player's advantage, had nearly unkillable units, and its base troops were often better than other armies' elites. It was so bad that there was a joke at the time that went something like this. Step 1, bring your demon's army to a tournament. Step 2, leave with your trophy. There are people that pick an army because they like the lore, they like the model's aesthetics, and countless other reasons. But there is another kind of collector / player that, unlike the others, is seemingly corrupted by the very powers of chaos itself. It's that guy who wants to win at any cost. This is impossible to prove, because outside of some things like the Tactical Space Marine kit outselling the entire Warhammer Fantasy range, we don't really know the sales numbers of individual kits. However, the fact that many power players started playing demons because of how overpowered they were, coinciding with more of their models being purchased by said players, it wasn't hard for Games Workshop to take a look at Matt Ward and say, this is our new golden boy. Or at least that's how a lot of people saw it at the time. The truth is that even though Matt Ward was the one credited with writing the book, it had to go through plenty of other people and had to be playtested before printing. Even though this book broke the entire game, it was multiple people's fault, not just Matt Ward's. But guess whose name was on the front page? Well, it was Matt Ward's. Fantasy was a third of the Warhammer line, as well as being the second most popular version. And to that part of the community, Matt Ward had ruined the entire game. There was definitely an overlap of players between the three lines though. So, like one of those schoolyard rumors, fantasy players that also played 40K, or even some who changed to a whole new game just because of that one army, started to warn others of Matt Ward's arrival. But Matt Ward was on a roll, and Games Workshop tasked him to write for not just the most popular variant of the game, Warhammer 40K, but its most popular faction, the Space Marines. The best way that I could describe how big the Space Marines are to Warhammer 40K would be to compare it to the Enterprise in Star Trek, lightsabers in Star Wars, and the Dragon Balls in Dragon Ball. Space Marines are often the first thing that people see when they learn about the setting. As models, they're pretty easy to build and pretty forgiving to paint. They're also one of the cheaper armies money-wise, considering you don't need to buy a whole lot of them to get a playable army. They have a very distinct silhouette, are almost in all of the lore, and have enough variety that there's something out there for everyone. If you want to play as the quintessential good guys in a universe that's lacking them, cursed to be an example of no good deed going unpunished, you pick my boys, the Lamenters. Or if you would rather play as a pack of ravenous thieves that will steal everything they can get their hands on from their allies, who don't even know who their daddy is, you pick the Blood Ravens. In the lore, the Space Marines are divided into 1,000 different chapters, each with a maximum of 1,000 members. Outside of the Dark Angels, but this isn't a 40K lore video, so I won't go into that. There wasn't really an official main chapter when it came to Space Marines either. 2nd edition had Blood Angels on its starter set cover, but you could paint the models however you liked. It was the same with the 3rd edition, which had Black Templars on its starter set and main rulebook. 4th edition had Ultramarines for its starter set, and it was Ultramarines again for the 5th edition Assault on Blackreach set. This time, however, Matt Ward's rules were actually pretty fine and not an issue, but it was the lore inside of the book that people didn't like. It focused mostly on the Ultramarines chapter, and cited their leader as all other Space Marines' spiritual liege. It focused on them so much that many to this day believe it was originally supposed to be Codex Ultramarines. Something that had been released before in other editions, as plenty of other popular sub-armies in these books will get their own codexes. The truth of the matter was, Games Workshop needed models to be in a uniform color scheme for all the pictures that they were taking of massive battles, and it was a lot easier to paint an Ultramarine than to paint some of the other chapters that used lighter colors such as white and yellow. Warhammer 40K 5th edition would end up having 6 different codexes of Space Marines, but the damage was done. Ward had ticked off 2/3 of Warhammer's fanbase, so why not go all in and make a 3 for 3? Lord of the Rings was more of a skirmish game than a mainline Warhammer game, which meant that you played with a lot fewer models than you normally would. At this time, 40K had an expansion called Apocalypse that would let you play gigantic games with tons of models. Of course, in order to play, you needed to have a lot of models. By 2009, Lord of the Rings wasn't as popular as it once was gaming-wise, and it was designed not to use that many miniatures, so Games Workshop thought that if bigger matches sold more models for 40K and Fantasy, they could do it again for Lord of the Rings. They then put Matt Ward in charge of the War of the Ring expansion, which would let people play huge matches in a game that was not designed in any way, shape, or form with that in mind. This split the player base between people who liked the new system and those who decided to stick with the skirmish-based game. It didn't help that you need to purchase movement trays as well for all your models, that again were never designed to use in the first place. That was all 3 of the mainline Warhammer games with an audience that was mad at Matt Ward for one reason or another. But in 2010, Matt Ward was able to get by with little controversy. 2011, however, did not go the same. In 2011, Matt Ward wrote the Grey Knights Codex, and what he did to Fantasy, he came dangerously close to doing again in 40K. The Grey Knights were a notoriously overpowered army and had special rules making them have blatant unfair advantages over other armies like Demons in the Tau. The best army lists in other armies struggled to take on the average Grey Knights list. Combine that with the fact that you could put these guys together, spray paint them silver, and call it a day, meant that a lot of power players immediately started playing them. That's not even mentioning one of the worst pieces of lore that Warhammer has ever had that's still discussed to this day, about a group of Grey Knights killing a group of space nuns, so that way they could wear their blood as protection against a demon. Everything I have mentioned together combined meant that some players had had enough and they were ready to take this offline. Now, I want to preface this right now. There's absolutely no evidence of this happening, and I even emailed Matt Ward asking for a comment, but alas, I got no response. There is a rumor that one day, while in a car parking lot, Matt Ward was confronted by multiple people about all the things he has written for, and some of these stories go so far to say that he was physically attacked in broad daylight. But considering the fact that Matt Ward says he was never given any death threats, I don't think that rumor is true.
Is it true that you got death threats?
No, I see that going around all the time. It's, as I say, it's that I see little bits and pieces like that and go, where does this come from?
Yeah.
I see all kinds of other little bits of connected, even down to and that's why they took the names off the books, because...
That's exactly what I was going to follow up with, yeah.
Absolutely not. But... yeah, it takes on a life of its own, and it's when it comes down to it, you've been very good, we've danced around it, but what it really comes down to is it comes down to the Space Marine Codex, and then for a much smaller subgroup of people, probably the Necron one that came after it, I think, and then the End Times, which is this whole other thing.
I think something to do with the Ultramarines being like, weren't they your favourite thing? And then people say you're an Ultramarines fanboy and you just wanted them to be the best and all this sort of stuff.
So we were talking about Space Crusade earlier.
Yeah.
So Space Crusade, Ultramarines, Blood Angels, Imperial Fists.
Sure.
Mine were always the Imperial Fist. You can tell mine are the Imperial Fist because I've got 2 Imperial Fist books with my names on that. Well, I say with my names on, it comes after that point, but I wrote 2 Imperial Fist supplements in the end because those were the chapter that I liked.
Regardless of whether or not this was real or not, however, there were a ton of people very upset with Mr. Ward, and they weren't afraid to talk about it. I've witnessed the full-on hate in person, in real life, by people who weren't hiding behind a safe anonymous forum persona. Though, I can't guarantee they weren't just typical nerd-raging man-child 40k players. In the realm of 40k players, these guys are fairly well-adjusted guys, and yet, they'd be willing to perch on a rooftop with a gun for a shot at Mr. Ward if they could. Concerning all this Matt Ward hate, I know everyone hates Matt Ward. In fact, I'm sure many of you would like to see him die a horrible fiery death, and not in the cool Viking way. After all, I've heard he writes bad and inconsistent fluff, mucks up on the rules, and has a strong preference for Ultramarines. But honestly, how much of this is his fault? I mean, is it really all just his fault? I'm sure he wrote the rules, but don't they have to pass through a lengthy editing and playtesting period by other experienced Warhammer players? I seriously doubt that Ward is cranking these out in his garage and getting them approved with little hindrance or oversight, so while the hate focused on one individual, just wondering what you all had to say about this. Nice try, Matt Ward. Hello, fellow 40k players. Found this petition on the net, aimed at that gentleman who's ruining both the fluff and the codexes. Enjoy, or ignore. Fire Matt Ward. Yeah, they made a petition to get him fired that managed to get just over 1,000 signatures in a year. That was a lot when you really think about how niche of a game it was back then, combined with how much smaller the internet was. It really is hard to show just how much Matt Ward hate there really was, because a lot of these old posts are just gone now. Forums like Warseer, Mini Wargaming, and many others have been shut down, and with them, so are their posts. But that's not even considering how many posts were removed by mods because of what they were saying. Death threats are kind of but Matt Ward did do some pretty irrevocable damage to the 40k lore. He basically wrote the equivalent of Rings of Power. People believed that it had gotten so bad that Games Workshop started taking the names of authors off of the rulebook so that way the authors wouldn't receive this kind of hate, so that way they could protect them. But before they started hiding the authors of their codexes, Games Workshop did what could probably be considered the funniest thing that they have ever done, and announced that Matt Ward would be writing the Demons of Chaos Army book for Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition, especially when Mr. Ward wrote the High Elves Army book that same year that may as well have just been called Demon Hunters. One of the many rules in Warhammer is that this is how combat roughly goes. You roll the dice to see if you hit, you roll the dice to see if you wound, and then your opponent gets to roll an armor/cover or what's known as an invulnerable/ward save, depending on if you're playing 40k or fantasy. If your opponent makes the required roll, their guy survives, taking none of the damage. Armor and cover saves can be negated, but invulnerable and ward saves cannot be. Well, Matt Ward gave the High Elves an item called the Banner of the Dragon. That item would give any model under its effect a 2+ ward save against magical attacks, meaning that after the enemy gets their hit and wound rolls in, if they used magic at all, ward save rolls of 2 or higher on a 6-sided dice meant it didn't do anything. Again, only if the opponent used a magical item or attack. All demon attacks are magic, meaning that if elves are equipped properly, they could just come in and steamroll their opponent. Kinda like how demons were doing the same thing to everyone else in the previous edition, huh? Then, in the summer of 2014, we found out that Matt Ward had left Games Workshop earlier that year, and how do you think the community reacted? Matthew Ward departs from Games Workshop. It seems the prayers of Games Workshop fans may have finally been answered. Nothing of value was lost. the damage he made cannot be undone. All I can say is, yes! Yes! The tabletop gaming site Bell of Lost Souls asked Matt Ward if he did in fact leave, and he responded saying, "I can certainly confirm that I'm no longer at Games Workshop. Beyond that, I doubt I've anything interesting to say. All the best to you and to the Bell of Lost Souls community." Matt Ward would then start writing articles on his blog, The Tower of Stars, and gave a proper send-off after it was publicly known that he had left Games Workshop. I can say it's been a blast writing for the worlds of Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. I've gotten to do all kinds of things that I never honestly believed I'd have the opportunity to do. I've no doubt that those worlds will keep getting bigger and better. Their futures are in the hands of some fantastically talented writers, artists, and sculptors. And I already miss working with them. For myself, I've, of course, moved on to other things, which I hope to be able to talk about in the not-too-distant future. And I hope those amongst you who've enjoyed my writing will stick around to see what I get up to. Matt Ward would then start to write his own novels such as a paranormal fantasy novella, Queen of the Evertide, and A Matter of Belief. People still complained about the things that happened in both Warhammer's rules and setting after Matt Ward had left. But he wasn't the only person writing lore and rules at Games Workshop. He was just the lightning rod that got virtually all the blame for the changes at the time. But then, on one day, on August 3rd, 2016, Matt Ward wrote a tweet that spread throughout a community that was more online than ever before. "So, it'd seem I have a new client." But this time, things were a little different. This time around, Matt Ward, instead of being attacked, would instead join the mob himself in a fight to save Warhammer. That's because Matt Ward went up against the enemy of KFC, Pokemon, and the FBI.
These organizations, the IFAW, Greenpeace, PETA, raise significant amounts of money. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that are being raised by these organizations. And let me tell you, the FBI right now have a file opened in their terrorism division investigating organizations like this, including the PETA organization, from a terrorism perspective.
That's right, PETA, the organization responsible for putting down over 40,000 cats and dogs. No pun intended. On January 30th, 2017, PETA called for Games Workshop to stop modeling fur onto its 28mm plastic, metal, and resin miniatures. From the Mighty Leman Russ in Horus Lupercal to Chaos Warriors and the Sisters of Silence, Warhammer features an abundance of characters who wear what appear to be animal pelts, which just doesn't add up. PETA has written to Games Workshop CEO Kevin Runterer asking that the leading British miniature wargaming brand ban fur garments from all Warhammer characters. While we appreciate that they are fictional, draping them in what looks like a replica of a dead animal sends the message that wearing fur is acceptable, when in fact it has no more place in 2017 than it would in the year 40,000. Well, King Matt Ward responded to this with an excerpt from a Warhammer 40K Codex that was actually pretty funny. New rule. When the news is weird, respond in kind. Hashtag not sure if serious. Hashtag 40K. 41st Millennia. Peters Foley. During routine survey of Deathworld Luthor McIntyre, Explorer Fleet Bellius is blocked by a civilian vessel, Peters Foley. protesting the unethical treatment of the Death World's inhabitants, Admiral Crack's patience is swiftly exhausted and orders the interlopers' destruction. However, Petor's folly falls silent before the first volley. Later investigations determine that the entire crew was slain by a follow-up of Catachan face-eaters, mistakenly liberated during a previous voyage. The creatures had waged a short but effective campaign of guerrilla warfare from within the Petor Foley's laundry room. Matt Ward then started getting praise from the Warhammer community instead of the universal contempt that he previously had. Once again, did you ever get to slip this into a timeline? Because this is quite possibly the best thing you have ever written. It was written much too late for that, alas. Mr. Ward, I believe you deserve a pardon. That's good, because I'm having a devil of a time getting these bloodstains out of my gloves, and the leaf mulch is gone and burnt itself out again. Something stuck in the blades, I think. Wait, what were we talking about? Matt Ward then wrote for the games Vermintide 2, Battlefleet Gothic 2, and my personal favorite of the three, Darktide, in 2018, 2019, and 2020 retrospectively. He also wrote his own fantasy novels Legacy of Ash, Legacy of Steel, and Legacy of Light. I'm going to be absolutely real with you guys right now. Matt Ward is not the Warhammer devil. He's a normal nerdy guy that likes sci-fi and fantasy. He builds Legos and plays Dark Souls.
Oh, I am absolutely in love with Dark Souls and have been for years now. And I include Bloodborne in that. Not so much Demon Souls, found that a bit clunky. But just the world building and the depth of detail that goes into those games is absolutely fantastic. It's really strange because it's not conventional narrative in there, because of course all the background is hidden in item descriptions and implied through the level design, which is then complicated further by the fact that, like any computer game, it's radically overhauled in the 6 months before releases. They realize they can't do everything that they wanted to, or the creative director's changed his mind about what wants to go in there at all. So everyone's there piecing together these little bits of lore in background and this and the other. This is the true story. And then they find something in the old files which was shipped with the game, go, but this completely changes the sequence of everything. But it doesn't matter, because the atmosphere behind them is just absolutely fantastic. I particularly like Bloodborne for its the way that it sort of starts in a sort of almost traditional Gothic horror setting. So it's vampires and werewolves and all of that good stuff. And then as the game goes through and your understanding of the world is evolving, it then transfers much more cleanly into almost sort of Lovecraftian era horror, and the sort of weird fiction aspect of it all starts to become a little bit different. And I'm not as much of a fan of Lovecraftian horror as I am sort of classic Gothic horror stuff, but just how it does that, and it almost becomes this, what's the phrase I'm looking for? It's almost this meta commentary on how the genre has evolved over the years.
The Matt Ward hate train has not only for the most part died down, but there are people that are willing to come out and thank Matt Ward for the things that he's written as opposed to straight up attacking him for it. Finally, phew, I just want to say I own a lot, far too many Space Marine reference books. As a 40K fan, I'd like to thank you for your work on the 5th edition Space Marine Codex. As a reference book, it's always the one I return to most often, and I'm sorry for stigma it received. I always thought it, and more importantly you, were treated unfairly, to put it mildly. Thanks for saying so. It is, fortunately, something that's a long way in the past now. I think the internet discourse of today is both better and worse than it used to be. And of course, 40K itself was going through a few changes at the time. As it is now, no franchise of any age survives without change. As for the rest, as long as folk like yourselves found joy in the books, then they did their job. Happy face. One of the straight up funniest things that I heard him say while researching this was the dude straight up says he doesn't have enough room for all the Legos in his house.
Is it possible to have too much Lego? There are two answers to this question, and it depends on a factor of how much space you have. I don't think conceptually you can have too much Lego. It's a wonderful thing. It's a brilliant way to express your personality. It makes your brain think about the world in a particular way. You can do so many wonderful creative things with it. And one of the things I'm always really grateful for is that I had loads of Lego when I was a kid, because I think that was just a fantastic tool for creative play. On the other hand, it does take up quite a lot of space, and you can't see it from here. But there is Lego all over this house now. My wife is incredibly tolerant as far as that's concerned. But, you know, because we have a Daily Bugle and a Millennium Falcon and an entire Hoth battle set and things like that, as well as a Cold Harbour Station that I've made and all the other bits and pieces. And there is definitely a hard cap on how much Lego I can fit in this house. So, lots of Lego, good. You can have too much. I have a horrible feeling I might be approaching that threshold, so I might be buying a little bit less from here on out.
Not only that, but while he may be British, he doesn't drink tea. He drinks coffee like a normal person.
How much tea does the editing process need you to drink? Oh, this is a dangerous one. I don't really drink tea. I will have brief dalliances with peppermint tea, which I know isn't even really a tea. I quite like it lapsang souchong from time to time, but I think as far as I can tell it's about like 95% caffeine, so I have to be careful about how much of it I drink. I like a little bit of Robius very occasionally, but to be honest, I much prefer coffee. And yeah, it's coffee tastes of something. Tea so rarely tastes of anything, and it's just that. Yeah, I don't get it. I've never understood it. And I realise half of you probably stopped watching the video at this point, but there it is. I don't really drink tea. Sorry.
Like I said earlier, I reached out to Matt Ward for a few questions, but unfortunately never got a response back. When it comes to everyone that I've covered on this channel, Matt Ward is easily the most normal of them all. But I mean, come on, that title was previously held by Spencer Nolan Rice. At the end of the day, Matt Ward drinks coffee, writes fiction for his own fantasy novels, Warhammer 40K and Frostgrave, with his wife and cats. I don't think that Warhammer will ever have a writer that was as universally hated as Matt Ward was, but if we're being honest, that's probably a good thing. The Lolcow trading card game has just gotten a little more advanced, not in its rules, but now adding in brand new lore for all your favorite cows and scribes, including yours truly. Adentum is a robotic scribe that spends all his time documenting all the lolcows of the digital and real world. Throughout many years of experience, this has prepared him for anything the lolcows may throw his way. Adentum is also a battle-hardened warrior that has many machinations at his disposal. Since he is the robot overlord, Adentum can construct more robots to do his bidding. The scribes have a powerful ally in this master of machines. The Acronian War is approaching, and Adentum is waiting. If you're interested in getting in on the action, or even want to test your luck by donning one of the Sonichu medallion shirts, check out my affiliate link down below.